Hi, everyone. It's almost happy hour. Who is ready for a drink? Awesome. Very cool. I'm Claire. This is the Beyond Tech Teams track. Today, or this evening rather, you're going to hear from Andy and Sundar, who are a legendary team. In fact, 3 characters in movies have been created after Sundar, and Andy has been to all of the pyramids in Egypt. He even rode around the Sphinx on a horse, which makes him sound pretty badass. So with no further ado, welcome Andy and Sundar to the stage.
Thank you, Claire. Hi. Good afternoon. How are we all doing? I'm right with you. I'm ready to go get a drink. Why don't we just jump right to that? All right, so today we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite topic, which is compliance and regulatory frameworks. And I'm sure I see all the smiles. That's such an exciting topic for everyone in the room. So we're going to talk about how we use Atlassian tools, specifically Jira, to integrate compliance workflows into your software and hardware development workflows in the healthcare and FDA space. So to start off with just a quick show of hands, how many of you work in a regulated industry? Wow. Okay. How many of you work specifically in life science or healthcare? Wow. Okay, the right crowd. Sweet. So it looks like everyone here should have something to take away from this, and we're going to kind of walk through some of the challenges and solutions we've seen to implementing Agile in the regulated framework. So just a quick overview of the agenda here. We're going to outline our challenge. We're going to talk about some of the methodology and the proven methods we've seen bringing them into these teams. We're going to touch on the processes and the tools that we use in Jira to do that. Then we're going to take a look at the human engineering element. What did you guys think of yesterday's session, the session with Big Potential and the importance of people and keeping teams happy? So that's a key part of this as well. And then the last part, we're going to talk about what does the outcome look like going forward. So to get you guys started, I'm going to turn it over to Sundar.
Thanks, Andy. Hello, everyone. Really good to be here. So in terms of seeing our engagement with a lot of different clients that we have seen, the common problem, there are different variations to it, but the fundamental problem that we actually see between the DevOps and the compliance teams is actually just trying to understand each other. So a lot of us are familiar with the telephone game or whispers. Let's just try to see what we hear across the different teams when we actually talk about. When DevOps have their drivers as innovation or speed to market, or in terms of their concept of launch and iterate, what exactly do the quality and compliance teams hear? They typically look at it as a concept that's unproven. They look at it as something that's taking the credibility of the company, and then they see that the risk is much bigger than the reward that they're trying to work towards. Let's flip the scenes a little bit and try to see what we actually hear when we go from the quality and compliance team when they're trying to work within the risk framework, talking about quantifying risk, cost of failure, and launch when ready. So when the quality compliance team talks about quantifying risk, DevOps hears documents. Cost of failure, what do we hear? Documents, more documents, right? So when we actually try to relate these two drivers for both the different teams that we are talking about here, we can actually see a relationship that's going and aligning with a specific process they are much more comfortable with. So the quality and compliance teams wants to go the waterfall model, and then the DevOps teams want to go with Agile. There's a little bit of interconnect that is there between these two. Barry Beam, as a renowned software engineer, he's a professor who talks about agility being a counterpart for discipline. So the effective root cause of the conflict between the two teams is how they hear each other and try to look at Agile and waterfall being conflicting to each other. Let's try to see what have been proven methods that have been effective with the different teams that we have worked with. But before going into that, I still want to just see a show of hands, if you guys don't mind. How many of you still use a waterfall in your company? That's a good 20%, I would say. Do you think good waterfall still works versus a bad Agile?
Nodding.
Some nodding heads. That's cool. What if the contest is between a good Agile versus a good waterfall? Yeah, we'll get to that. We'll revisit that and see where we land. But the most important question to take away here is not to look at what you are comfortable with or your team is comfortable with, but to look at it in the larger picture of the context of what is actually good for your company. Does it really work for the company, not just your particular team? To take a closer look at what and why the quality and compliance teams prefers waterfall, I want to focus a little bit on the different teams and the different points in time that they are involved with. I want to draw specific attention to just three groups: the dev, the BA, and the business analyst. If you see the start of the process is the problem as well, is that there's BAs who are involved with about 65% in the initial stages of the process. But a lot of the iterations and the changes that's actually happening at the vertex here, you almost see them less than 10%. So there's a huge handoff that's already happened even before you start pushing it out. So it leaves very little room for human error in terms of what was interpreted between the business end users and what's actually being developed and being pushed through the testing pipeline. Now let's take a look at how it's working and why DevOps is much more comfortable with the Agile format itself. Again, I want to draw your attention here to the blue bars here, where you're talking about trying to ship 4 features, but you're trying to ship A and B as one iteration, and then C and D in the next one. But you can see that the blue bars already involve the development and the testing before you're even pushing the first part of it. So this ensures that you are actually creating quality products that are being delivered in smaller scale, which is very, very common that we have seen with the DevOps team. But the challenge that we see in adoption of this within the FDA, the regulated companies, is what actually is the value for your company? What are you focused on trying to deliver? If you're a much smaller software development company trying to just get your product first out to the market, most of your innovation and the drivers that you're actually working towards is going to be around, sorry about that, is around what is the scope that you can deliver. Can I ship specific number of lines of code every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, whatever your duration is, and make that predictability a pattern so that you can win the trust of your customers. But in terms of trying not to go with just one of the 2 options, it's very important to actually see how we can blend those 2 processes together. One of the clients that we have actually worked with, we had done this kind of a fusion where we took full advantage of their validation environment. All of you must be familiar with the validation environment, which is very different from the production environment before you deploy. So in this particular case, we typically had a requirements gathering that was typically done in a waterfall method, but there is some room to play with in terms of when you try to finalize your requirements and start building versus starting to draft some of your requirements initially, and then your Agile team starting to actually develop it and potentially use your validation environment as your playing ground to get your end customer feedback. So if you could take full advantage of your validation environments for each of the releases, you could get to a point where your final release gets pushed in, or you have much more clearer defined milestones at which point you can push what you have built into your production environments. But be aware that each of these releases have all the planning, development, continuous integration, unit testing, and the functional and the acceptance testing. Effectively meaning you are trying to leverage the business analysts or your internal team testers, at which point who have approved at least some set of the requirements that are supposed to be part of the waterfall traditional method. This is another fused model which has been endorsed by the FDA as well. It's been extremely popular amongst the medical device community. Here, you would actually see that the project inception starts in a particular iteration, let's say iteration n-1. You have the requirements going all the way till the risk identification, traditionally relatable to a change management method where you identify some of the risks of that particular change that you're trying to push into the environment. In the following iteration, you start writing the test and also developing your code. Here, you could move in this particular iteration in terms of till completing that, whatever you're scoping within that particular iteration. And then in the third one, you can move into the verification testing, which would be considered your release. Now, the scoping of how much you are trying to plan for each of the iterations and what you are defining within the change management do not have to be aligned, because effectively your requirements that you are defining here are all getting released together at one point. So what you are actually trying to develop within your change management can be a bigger, let's say, across three different iterations or 4 different iterations. Break it away from the quality compliance and the change management stakeholders, push it back to the developers who can start developing and pushing their releases into your val environments and testing that out and making it ready and available for release. Now, there is an issue with this model as well, which is what happens when you actually find bugs. There's a lot of reliance on this middle iteration model where you are trying to write, test, and develop and create the acceptance testing. So if you see items failing here, you have to find a way to limit the scope of what you're planning to push in the release based on what you find in the bugs over here. Or you'll have to push those issues, if it is of a higher criticality, back into your requirements and see how you can scope it out in a subsequent release. Another thing that this model has been effective to prove is that you can create that same predictable releases with your customers. Now, this is something that is just the process element of it. There is much more that could be achieved as well. We have actually seen, just with the process change, releases reducing from a 12-week cycle to a 3-week cycle. But there is so much more that we can take advantage of from the Atlassian Jira that I'm going to pass it back on to Andy to walk us through.
Cool. Thanks, Sundar. So how many of you actually administrate or work directly with the administrators of your Jira environments? Awesome. So many of you. So one of the things we wanted to do, now that you've kind of got a vision of what we're trying to do with the methodology, was actually start talking a little bit about what this looks like with implementation. So we're going to dive into 6 examples here. We're going to talk about one is electronic signatures, and then publishing, testing, and validation, obviously a core area of any regulatory framework model, CAPA management, traceability, and then probably one of the most common topics, which is change management. So in the first one here is probably one of the easiest things to get moving inside of your environment is adopting some pretty basic add-ons that allow you to do 21 CFR Part 11 compliant electronic signatures. And I probably don't even need to ask the show of hands, but I will. How many people are familiar with 21 CFR Part 11? Of course, we all are. All right, so this is pretty standard. You need to be able to enter in 2 things that identify you are who you say you are. So inside of Jira, we've actually brought the ability for you to enter in a username and password as evidence, and then also identify what the meaning of your action is. And we, of course, record this in an audit log, so it can be retrieved later. The next piece is publishing these pieces, and one of the great questions that came up in the earlier session on compliance at Atlassian was how do you publish the data out of Jira to show it with your auditors or other teams inside of your organization. So we have these other capabilities and tools that allow you to take the templates you already have inside of Word, or maybe there's things that you've set up, whatever document publishing tool you have, and allow you to export your data into those templates. That way they can easily be brought into your document management systems. We already mentioned validation testing being a core piece of this. There's lots of great testing add-ons out there. We strongly encourage you to find one that works for your team and allows you to not just capture your tests for pre-approval and post-approval, but allows you to actually repurpose test libraries over time as you're continuing to iterate on these releases. And then the last part is bringing, this one might be one of the more interesting or nuanced ones in this, is bringing things that you typically would do in your quality management system into your actual workflows where your software and hardware development is going on. So how can you start bringing these teams together using the same tool? Well, you start taking some of the same things they're used to tracking and showing them that they can track those inside of the same application. So we can actually bring CAPAs and incidents and deviations inside of the same environment that you're actually recording your features, your requests, your tests. Tying it all back together, traceability reports, right? So I need to be able to show from my requirements through my specifications to my tests executions, all the way through. What's the big picture of what my release looks like? Am I ready to go to production? Do I need to go back and fix something? Do I need to take something off of the production build for this release? So this gives you a nice snapshot of what that looks like, and also it can generate a great report that auditors love to look at whenever they're trying to make sense of your production releases. And then also the status of where things are. And this is really what's driving. What are you focusing on right now? Where's your attention need to be for you to get this release out on schedule? Now, for the next three here, we're going to go a little bit deeper into the administration side. Workflows. Many of you are familiar with Jira's workflows features. It's probably one of its most popular features as an application. We actually, when we start working with clients, we try to either take procedures they already have documented in their policies, or we work with them to help define what those procedures would look like on paper. And then that starts helping us diagram out what does the flow of these statuses look like. And of course, this is going to be different for each type of item you have inside of your project. So this is going to look a little bit different for requirements than it will for test or for your CAPAs. This specific example is what one of our clients' CAPA workflows looks like. So you can see that they're going to go through a pre-approval step, then they're going to transition it. Now, these transitions, as you know, in workflows, you can enforce certain triggers and rules and things that happen in these status changes. So one of the great things you can do is enforce that electronic signature to pop up and sign off when I'm now ready to transition something into an approval state. So now I've captured both the status change, the approval of that status change, and the audit log record of that change. Scripting now. How many of you have scripted anything inside of Jira workflows? Great, man, this is a great crowd. So I can't say I've ever seen that in any other audience. So scripting this allows us to go even a step further than popping up certain screens or saying certain fields need to be modified. With scripts, we can actually enforce rules that say, hey, this can't happen. Like you have procedures and policies that prevent you from moving this forward without you having an approval or without having everyone that's been assigned this ticket recording an action or task associated with it. And so that really is what allows us to bring some of those things that you typically find in traditional quality management systems into more of the agile environment that Jira typically does for your hardware and medical device teams. And then, of course, we do that across all of our tickets, and a very common approach with our clients is to separate out unique projects for each one of those ticket types. So doing all this inside of one environment allows you to do requirements, your test, your validation elements in separate projects, and allows you to bring these custom workflows and scripts to each one. And then thanks to Atlassian's latest announcement of Jira Server being a beta product on the mobile, and many of you already use Jira Cloud, you can follow along in transition and get your notifications on the go. So while you're on the road, you can keep on track of this. And all great quality compliance teams means that you got a team there waiting to move things forward. You know, they're saying, oh, compliance is holding us back. We need to be able to do that while we're on the go so that people aren't depending on you. And the last screen I'll leave you with here is just a sample dashboard. And this is just showing you a kind of a big picture view across the project of everything going on in our quality. So we have our issues, our incidents, we have our risk plans, we have kind of where our attention needs to be, who's working on things, who needs to be kind of maybe setting up a meeting to see where things aren't working quite right, and are we ready to go to production? And so we can do that all inside of one dashboard. Now for the last section, I'm going to turn it back over to Sundar and touch a little bit on kind of the human engineering side of this equation.
Awesome. Thank you, Andy. Perfect. So now we have the process reasonably proven. We have tools that make it work. So do we really need this section? So I think the whole summit is focusing on the human element of Jira and how we can try to bring this change about across all the different stakeholders. How many of you are familiar with the kind of a framework? Okay. So I just wanted to get a gauge of how deep I need to go into this. So this is a framework. It's a decision-making framework. When we are talking about humans, it's always very effective when we are trying to understand how humans process information. I would strongly encourage you guys to take a look at this if you're having any kind of friction across the DevOps and compliance teams within your organizations or your teams itself. So obvious is typically where you have something that you get a sense of, you categorize where that information has to be put in, and that's how you actually respond to it. So typically think of it as an assembly line where where every time you expect the same thing to be repetitive, happening across all the different teams that are involved. It's going to be the same. That's where best practices are going to be much more effective. The next one is the complicated segment, where you don't want to be able to just take a standard set of rules and apply that and say that this is exactly how you need to work. So this complicated segment is where you make decisions based on trying to sense the situation, analyze it, and you have a few different variations of how you respond to that particular information that you've actually sensed. So you have a broader sense of how you could use different pieces of information and present a particular customized solution for your particular team. A complex system where you are trying to make your own decision is where you actually first start probing the complexity of the situation. Then you try to sense what you are probing, and then you respond to it. So in a complex situation, you see a lot of new, different interpretations of what you're trying to probe. Once you start probing into a particular system, then you try and understand how many different variations that you may have not even been able to think of earlier. You get a reasonable idea about it, and then you build on with input from different people, and then you actually try to respond based on that. Chaotic is, think of it as, first you act, then you make a sense of what you have already done, and then respond to it. So typically, a key point to note is, once it is obvious, it's very, very easy for somebody to become complacent with those practices and slip back from an obvious state where their system is back into a chaotic state where there's absolutely no clarity on how your team is actually operating. Now, because you want to first probe, sense, and then respond, this is typically where your DevOps team most of the time lies. And everybody working in the regulated industry is familiar with the term GCP, GLP, GMP, and we all know what it stands for. By definition of the framework, this is where your quality and compliance teams actually lie. So you're trying to actually bridge how a decision is being made across the emerging practices with your DevOps team versus your quality and compliance teams who actually operate here. So this is an extremely important factor when you're trying to create the message that you want your team to actually start aligning their practices. You're trying to create a message for your own future. For your organization's future to have a message that is based on the different stakeholders having different frameworks for their decision making, you need to bring them all together. You have to have a message that's very intentional. You have to be patient with your message, and you have to be persistent with your message. An example of something that you want to stay on is being inclusive, that it's not just about a particular team's efficiency of operating. It's about the whole company operating for a better future. And that's what leads to your culture as well. But there's an important piece that's actually going to have to be inherent within your operations, going from where your message is and to the culture, which is commonly overlooked, is actually your data. In a lot of teams operating across DevOps and compliance, they look at information as currency. The power is lying where who holds the information itself. If you want to have much effective and much more productive teams that can actually work with each other, you need to have a single source of truth. And your truth should be your data. Having visibility across your different teams and knowing what the other person is actually looking at is also the same piece of data, but not siloed into a separate quality management system away from where all your engineering and DevOps operations happen, is extremely important to make sure that the different teams that you're actually working with are all creating the same perceptions that is based on your common source of data, the truth. And that is what leads them to develop into their own belief systems, how they actually translate their perceptions into all the way to the culture where you can start nurturing a culture of actually finding true value. You can stop all the bureaucratic processes that are involved in between. You can cut down on all the bullshit and then lead to a much more quality and much more better future. leading all of these is going to get you to the point of where the future is going to be for your company. Depending on how you are defining your message to be, you have to simplify your organization's use of different systems. There's a client in the Bay Area that we are working with. We are trying to go away, move 13 systems that they are currently using and replacing them all on Jira. That's a single system that they're going to go on from right now. So imagine the amount of simplification of that it can actually create. It can create so much of transparency and collaboration. Once you are actually aware that what your other team is actually working on, what is the other team's dependency, when do they need it, how much is it actually reliant on that, makes it much more effective for them to collaborate. You've all heard of how different teams actually go from the stages of forming, storming, norming, and performing. So that's typically where your transparency of your systems and the data can actually help your team to actually move through those stages much, much faster. I'm going to pass this back to Andy to actually talk about how you can actually take specific action items from here and then take it back to your own organizations to help you integrate Jira into your quality and DevOps operations.
Awesome. So I know many of you know that you're going to be able to find these slides in this presentation afterwards. So I'm not going to walk through all of these individually, but these are just some recommended next steps we encourage you to take and kind of going back and talking to your team. And ultimately, where we want to get the conversation going is how do you get these teams to work together so that they share a common vision and they share a tool set that allows them to both accomplish what's in front of them. And our experience working with clients is there's typically unbalanced beam kind of between your compliance teams and your DevOps teams. And different organizations, sometimes the DevOps holds the keys, sometimes quality holds the keys. But trying to find that balancing act is a key part, and that typically starts just by coming to the table, putting your guard down, and aligning to the same goal and vision. Now, we've kind of walked through the three things that we think are kind of core components of this, the methodology, the methods, finding the things that you're comfortable with, working with your auditors, the processes and tools that help you achieve that, and then focusing on the people on your team and the human aspect of it. We encourage you to kind of reach out to Sierra Labs. We'd love to help you along your journey. We think this is an exciting time in compliance and looking at the new technologies coming out and with the FDA and kind of where things are going with medical devices. So please reach out to us. You can find us at Sierra Labs on Twitter, or you can go to sierralabs.com. Thank you, everyone. And I think we have a couple minutes for questions.